I'm thinking about Baudrillard again. I was talking about a bit yesterday, and I'm trying to remember what I think he probably referred to as the stages of simulation, or he might have used different terminology. But it's ages since I'd read anything about Baudrillard, so I can't really remember. But from what I remember, and I'm going to try and reconstruct as much as I can. What he's talking about there is he says that simulation, copying, faking, pretending, which are all kind of variants on this idea that he talks about, is goes through a number of different stages. There's different types of it, and they do different things, which, as I say, I think he refers to as the stages of simulation. So the first stage of simulation, I think I've got this right, is copying. So there's the original, and then it's simulated version, it's copy. And an example of that might be well, my kitchen floor. Actually, my kitchen floor, if you just glance at it, looks like it's maple, but if you get down, actually you don't even need to get down, if you just look at it for more than a second, you can tell that it's actually kind of melamine veneer stuff. I don't know what it's called, but it's a kind of plasticky stuff, really. So it's a copy, it's a superficial copy of an original, and the original is very available. You know, if I go to a flooring shop, you can't buy the actual maple boards, or you can, different kinds of finish, which is the real wood, or you can do the cheap option, which of course is what I did. So it's just a copy of the original, and that's the first stage of simulation. The second stage of simulation in Baudrillard, I think, is where the copy masks the original. So there's still an original, but it's kind of masked and hidden behind the original, so it's difficult to get to the original because of because it's completely covered by the simulation, in a way that the empire in Borges is completely covered by the map of itself. But an example of that, which somebody pointed me to, and I don't know how valid this is cowboys. Now certainly, and this is a UK perspective, so it probably feels very different to other people, but certainly there were people living, and indeed there still are people living in the United States, in the West, who look after cows. I mean, that certainly is a job. There are such people as cowboys. But the image that I have of a cowboy, a product of thousands of Hollywood films and pictures and all that kind of stuff, is a very particular version. It's a simulation, it's a copy of something. It's a guy who stands a bit like Elvis in that film, or the one that was reproduced by Andy Warhol. Legs slightly apart, he's got a gun, maybe he's got two guns actually. He's probably quite well groomed. That's a cowboy, and that's the simulated cowboy that I have in my mind. But I've no real idea. Well, I've got some idea. I know there's some statistics I read that a very high percentage of cowboys were blacks. Most cowboys didn't carry guns. Yada yada yada. They're a bit more like drovers that we have in this country. But it's very hard to get to the real cowboy because the simulation is completely masking it. And in Baudrillard's terms, that's the second order of simulation, in which the copy masks the presence of the original. I think he says something like that. The third order of simulation, which is in a sense it's the hardest, I think, is something like, and I may be way off here, he says something like the simulation, the copy, masks the absence of an original. So there is no original, there is just the copy. And I'm racking my brains trying to think of an example of that. I mean, the copy I've heard, and the example I've heard on, which I have to say I don't really understand, is fast food restaurants, things like McDonald's. All McDonald's look like every other McDonald's, and really all fast food joints look like every other fast food joint. And they all kind of suggest an original somewhere, but there isn't really an original. They're just copies of copies of copies. But I don't think that's a particularly compelling example for myself. I don't get it from that, really. The idea is that you have to find a simulation which is recognizable as a simulation. So you're looking at it, you think, oh yes, this is a copy of something. It's a copy of an original. But when you try to find the original, there is no original there. It's just the copy. So it has there's some of the qualities of simulation, but none of the kind of epistemological grounding and any kind of real or authentic, I suppose. What would an example of that be? I'm not sure. I know Umberto Eco talks about this. In Umberto Eco's books, Travels in Hyperreality, which is quite an old book now, he's kind of exploring that world. He takes you through Disneyland and he takes you through various other places, all of which seem to be pointing to an original, but there's no actual original there that they point to. I suppose where it's going for me, I don't know how much time I've got left on here, but I suppose where it's going for me is to do with it's kind of linking this stuff up with those interests in metaphor that I've spoken about before, because it seems to me there is a relationship to be exploited there if I should choose to do so. Because clearly a traditional view of metaphor, a historical view of metaphor, is that it kind of parallels Baudrillard's first order of simulation. There's the thing you want to talk about, there it is, and then you copy it in kind of florid and poetic form. There's the copy of it, and it's this metaphor is a particularly attractive simulation, if you like. But there is absolutely original, which you can get to. And then there's this second order simulation, which I guess in metaphorical terms would be when there is an original, there is a way of clearly understanding the thing you're talking about, and then but you can't get to it because the metaphor completely covers the experience. Let me think of an example of that. Well, I suppose something like love, and this is not a really good example, it's just what's coming to mind right now. There is such a thing as love. We all experience love, and we all have those kind of fascinations and attractions and desires. But the metaphors which kind of encrust on the top of this idea of love, metaphors to do with journeys, metaphors to do with dances, metaphors to do with ownership, metaphors to do with closeness, physical closeness, proximity, metaphors to do with merging. There's all kinds of metaphors which basically make up the texts of pop songs and love poems. All that kind of thing is an encrustation, so it's actually very hard, I think, to see through those metaphors, and it's impossible to talk about love, I think, without using those metaphors. So it does exist, but it exists as a second order simulation, so it masks the presence of the original. All those Barbara Cartlet novels and all those love songs mask the presence of the original, I guess. And then there's a third order of simulation in Baudrillard in which the metaphor masks the absence of an original. I'm just trying to think what a metaphorical example of that might be. I suppose I can only think of science here, and it's not great. But certainly to the extent that metaphor exists in science, as it clearly does, it suggests the existence of an original. We think of subatomic particles as particles, which means small. We kind of envision them as like little granular entities, which they're clearly not. Or we talk about the Big Bang, and we kind of imagine a little explosion, or explosion in space. Or we talk about, all the various metaphors that colonize our imagination and help us to think we understand science. They all of them suggest that there is some kind of original thing which we really could understand if we wrapped our heads around it far enough. But for most of those things there isn't. They mask the absence of an original. Of course, that something like the Big Bang must have happened, I guess, who knows. And yes, there are entities smaller than atoms, presumably, or there is something going on at the subatomic level. But those metaphors kind of give us confidence that there is an original there, really. It's just very hard to find. There is something authentic to be discovered there, it's just masked. But I think what's being masked there is the absence of an original.